The fact that emotional processing precedes conscious awareness and colors your conscious thought in ways you aren't aware of, that happens.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we don't see
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast.
John Bunch, you are also known as the Reverend Milton John Bunch.
Sometimes, yes.
John Milton Bunch is what I should
Different
say.
incarnations. Yes.
Mm-hmm. You are our secret Florida swamp backer.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have Peter Thiel in the background. We have you pulling the strings in the background.
That's right, pulling the strings. And nobody knows my particular political affinity. They really don't, right? It's a little bit obscure because if you read my social media stuff, which is, I don't do as much as a lot of people, it's kind of all over the place and you don't really know, right? And I like it that way.
Right. That's it. I feel like what you're doing. Have you ever heard of the game Illuminati?
Yes, of course. Well, the game Illuminati. No, I know the book, the Robert.
There was a card
REW book, but
no, that was a card. It's kind of like Magic.
Magic the Gathering. I know what that is.
Yeah. So this was a card game called the Illuminati, and what you do is you would collect secret societies and institutions and agencies and sometimes countries in your deck, and so you would have, and you didn't always have to have the secret societies that were aligned. There were sometimes it would be worthwhile as a strategy to have aligned secret societies, so you get to do certain maneuvers if you had everyone aligned. But at the same time, if you had a whole bunch of oppositional groups in your control, then that gave you a lot of maneuverability. So I feel like I don't know which strategy you're working with when it comes to your quest for world domination. Do you have a whole bunch of oppositional groups in your deck of cards, or are you all getting them all aligned? Let's not answer that question. Yeah,
it's a good question. I don't know how much I can really disclose about all of the backstory, but the forces are aligning as I anticipated they would. So
yeah, I'm glad to hear that. So to get to what this conversation is about, we've been debating whether or not I'm scientifically illiterate or to a degree to which idealists, Marxists, and socialists of various types have a misconception of what the human being is, and hold on to a kind of an idealized, hyper rational subject. Like we think, oh, everyone sits down, and at the end of the day, they're a philosopher in the evening, and they make arguments in their own head and with each other, and then they calculate what their resources are, and they try to determine the truth, and they arrive at the truth, and then they act on that. That's what you think that we think that people do.
I think I don't want to say we as in everyone, but certainly some part of that we, absolutely. Yes.
Like Ashley and I would like to pretend that maybe we do that. Perhaps, right? Or that that we would like it if everyone did that. That would be, I would say I would like it if everyone sat down and tried to think through what they actually believe, debate it with each other, and act on what they come to think is true. I think that would be a great world.
I can't argue with that.
Yeah, but I know that people don't, or that it's difficult, and it's more difficult for some people than others. And so this is what we're going to talk about. There was an article in Sublation called Evolutionary Subjectivity.
Yeah.
And we want to get Charles Roseman on in the future. Maybe all three of us, maybe just you and he can discuss it. But what is you're pro evolutionary psychology?
Yes, I could talk about that. I actually had a very good. I would encourage people to read the Twitter exchange I had with Charles Roseman. I was pretty brutal. Did you read that, Doug? By the way,
I looked through it, but I'll link to it in the.
I was a little brutal. I'll tell you, it's an interesting story. I didn't know who he was, and I read the article, and it really triggered me. I'm telling you, it triggered me. I was triggered. So well, as you and the other Sublation people know, I sort of, was talked about. Well, I railed to you guys about it, and I was going to write. Well, got 5K into a response to it, 5K words into a response to it.
That's great.
And then Roseman tweeted about it, and I replied to his tweet and just really ripped him one on the tweet. Went overboard. Right? It was a little unfair, but it was Twitter, and that's just it's Twitter. So he responded, and then we actually got into a civil discussion again on Twitter, which is kind of shocking, but it was a civil discussion. And in the end, I think it would be a very good. I think if anyone reads his article and then reads my volatile response to it and then follows that Twitter thread, it's pretty instructive. I think in the end, and then we DM'd each other, talked about it, and I think we came to a pretty good agreement. I mean, I think he understands what my position is, and probably I can't speak for him, but I think he, more or less. I think that if we were to sit down and have a further conversation like you and I are having now, we would agree much more than we disagree. So, and he understood my point. He understood the point I was making.
So what do you think it is about evolutionary psychology that makes or leads many people on the left to react so negatively against it?
Okay, so there's a couple of things. One is, and this isn't just about people on the left. People of, and by the people on the left, I don't mean all people on the left. I mean, there are sort of some leftist, I don't want to say, there's some leftist affinity groups, right? I don't know that you can really call, I don't know that it makes much sense anymore in the age of social media to talk about theory so much as affinity groups, but that's a different story altogether. Certain left affinity groups, I think, have a very difficult time with it. Others not so much, and so I don't want to say it's everyone on the left. But one of the issues for any political theory, left, right, or anywhere, is just that you have to have some perspective, some concept of the individual, who the individual is, the nature of the individual, right? So no one wants to deny, well, I haven't used the term human nature yet, but we'll probably eventually get there. So everyone has to have some concept of the individual, who the individual is, what the individual is, what constitutes the individual, right? To what extent is there something unique within the individual that mitigates the social, for example, right? So we know we are social creatures, cultural creatures, interdependent on other humans and so on. Right? That's clear. But within that, to what extent is there an individual who is unique from all other individuals, regardless of any social or cultural or environmental influence, right? In other words, if we had two people, right, and they were to experience exactly the same social conditions, would they react to them in the same way? Would they both thrive in them? Would they both perceive they had freedom in them, right? Or is there something unique within the individual that has an impact? So to me, that is sort of an empirical question. I mean, it's or at least it's a fact claim one way or the other, And so if you are and we don't really know the answer to it, right? I mean, to be honest, if we take kind of a scientific approach to it, we can say that the evidence points one way. I mean, I would argue the evidence points to some individuality. I think most people who looked at it probably would, but even if we don't look at the scientific evidence, I think we have to at least say that we don't know. It's an unanswered question. So we have to leave room for it in any political theory. And when a political theory, or when someone's belief in a political theory is such that it can't accept challenges, or it has no room to shift its definition of the individual, then it will try to erase the individual, right? The individual is no longer important. What's important is this particular collection of social changes, whatever it is. And I mean, this is left wing, right wing. It's essentially the same thing here, right? So if I have a particular social program in mind, or I have this model, this political model of the way the world works, call it an ideology, whatever you will. If I have this particular model or picture in mind of these, cause and effect relationships about how the world works and why this thing happens and that thing happens and what should happen. If that depends on a particular conception of the individual, then I don't have room to allow for an actual free individual, right? If that individual is other than what I think it is, right? And I think evolutionary psychology and other fields like it, right, that try to measure and understand things about uniqueness and things about what drives people to think the way they think and feel the way they feel, experience things the way they do. I think fields like that offer they at least question, or they at least state the premise that we don't really know the answer to this. There could be unique stuff there, right? And that's threatening in itself. Now, when those fields then come back and say, hey, guess what? We found that there's some, we found that there, in fact, are unique, there's some good evidence to suggest that there are, in fact, physiological differences between people that are, in fact, innate and do, in fact, impact their experience of the world, including things like the way they approach politics, morality, well, that's real threatening, right? Because now you've got actual empirical evidence that there's some processing happening inside that individual that mitigates whatever it is society does, right? So if that's the case, then it becomes difficult, right, to make a claim that any particular change in conditions is going to have any particular effect, because now you've got more than one kind of individual, right? Now you've got individuals who respond to those changes in more than one way, and that complicates things, right? I mean, this complicates, and again, I don't want to pick on any particular theory on the left, because the left is no more or less guilty of this than in any other sort of paradigm. It's just so it's just the nature of it, I guess.
Can I respond? Because I definitely there are a couple of things I would question in what you've said. Not that I don't believe that there are individuals and that biology makes a difference, and you can see that. For instance, look, some people are born and they grow to be 5 feet tall, and some people are born and they grow to be 7 feet tall, and that could be influenced by the environment. They could be raised in a box that only has 5 feet or something like that. But
or poor nutrition,
but where there's a lot of evidence that height has some, it comes from your genetic inheritance off to a large degree, and I'll just grant you that. Mm-hmm. And there are a number of things, many things that are like that. So that I don't have a problem with that. What I have a problem with is the idea that all political theories have to start with a theory of the individual. Oh, I don't think that's true, and here's why I say that. I think that there are political theories, pre-modern ones, that don't emphasize the individual, but emphasize where, how, let's say, God wants to divide up a society and what kinds of people there are, but not what is the character of and the level of variability within individuals. Just focus on the different attributes and capabilities of individuals arises as a problem in a society that presupposes that every individual has equal rights. Every individual has the obligation to participate as a citizen in society, and every individual is ultimately an end and not a means. Those are so I don't disagree with you that we should be concerned with the individual, but what I would say is we should also recognize that when we turn to the individual as being at the center of our politics, we have arrived at modernity and we are being very modern, and that isn't a bad thing at all. That's actually what I would definitely support that, but we should also realize that it is a kind of accomplishment to even start with the individual in your political theorizing.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. And I to clarify, I'm not, my intent is not to put the individual at the center of the political theory, but it is to at least carve out space for the individual. At least carve out space so that if you're, I mean, especially if you're going to have a kind of emancipatory politics, you've got to have some idea of the thing you're emancipating, right? I mean,
right.
So it's not that the whole thing, it's not that all politics or all of society has to surround the individual, but the society does have, whatever the goals of the society are, right? Or whatever the goals of the theory are, there has to be some appreciation for how it's going to deal with the fact that people will experience things, same thing in different ways. So, I don't have a solution to that. And this is another thing I want to make clear when you talk, often, and, I'm not a book author and I don't have a long series of publications where people can read my own political philosophy, but, what was I going to say there?
Which is a good thing, because if they did have that capacity,
right,
then you wouldn't be able to secretly in the shadows run the world.
It, pull the strings. That's true.
Yeah,
What I was going to say was that, I don't have a particular political theory or philosophy that I am pushing. In other words, I'm not, and a lot of times when I talk to people, this gets, immediately people want to pigeonhole you. Oh, you're a this, you're a that, you're a, well, you're a communalist. You're a this. No, I don't intend to be anything. The only point I'm making here is just that, any theory has to account for the individual. So, and again, my general background regarding political theory and political sort of sectarianism, I guess, is that I don't think that anybody, any theory, any theorist has anywhere near enough of has a valid enough model to say that someone is a this or that. So to sort of adopt as a ideology. So my perspective is we just don't know enough. The only thing we can really do is try to sit down and think about things. And it doesn't make much sense. I think it's counterproductive to sort of pick a theory and then filter the whole world through it. To me, you have to, which is what a lot of people do. To me, you have to start with the idea that, you really don't know. You don't understand the phenomenon of society. You don't understand the phenomenon of political change over time. We can tell ourselves we do, and we can, but we really don't. So, unless you've got that kind of, I think people need that sort of intellectual humility in order to be able to look at, real events in the real world and history and make sense of it. Without, it's my little rant about it, but yes, yeah, so
I totally agree.
That's
totally
the position I'm coming from on it. So I'm not, so just the point is, I don't have any particular political axe to grind when I defend evolutionary psychology. I guess that's where I was going with all this.
Yeah. So, like when I first encountered evolutionary psychology as a set of ideologies, I was pretty old already. I think I was in my early 40s, maybe late 30s, but probably early 40s. So not maybe a decade ago. And the people I ran into would have been people like Gad Sad. And who else?
Maybe Steven Pinker.
Steven Pinker, yeah. And a bunch of people who were making feminists very upset. Because they would say things like, look, there's a kind of female body that men are attracted to for reasons of evolutionary psychology. And this is what the ratios are. We've done the research. And if you don't have that, then, look, I'm a short man. I'm squat. I'm fat. I feel you. But in fact, I'm not the type that women find attractive. You may not be the type that men find attractive. And we just have to live with it. And feminists were up in arms about that, I guess. And I thought about that at the time and wondered, why are we needing for biology to solve our love lives for us? Like, I'm nearsighted, so I have glasses. Maybe you don't have the perfect female form according to evolutionary psychology. So, get a dress that looks good on you and develop other strategies to win over mates and things like that. Or, and is mating really the center of everything? And also, is the problem that we're encountering between the sexes really down to evolutionary psychology? Maybe that's not the level where we neither need to deny evolutionary psychology nor turn to it to solve the social problem.
So what you're saying is perhaps evolutionary psychology does not provide the theoretical foundation on which a society should be built. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm saying that we should take it into account, but
sure.
Another example would be Jordan Peterson years later was talking about how if you look, it's not the lobster. No, it's some other studies. I think it was Sweden. When you look to gender roles in societies, what you'll find is that those societies which have provided the most support to women and have the most parity or equality between the sexes are the ones where there's the most differentiation between the genders in terms of the kinds of jobs people seek. So if you are in a very patriarchal authoritarian society like Iran, you'll find men and women both are really struggling to get into the sciences. But in Sweden, a more affluent society and one where there's more gender equity, women tend to go into the caring professions much more. And
I don't have any problem believing that. Yeah.
And men are more likely to be engineers or want to work with their hands. And that has to do, he says, with evolutionary psychology, with the way in which men and women are different for biological reasons, not just in terms of their physicality, in terms of their height or muscle mass, but also down to the ways in which they are likely to perceive and interact with the world, what they're biologically driven to be psychologically. And so what my thought about that was that's probably no problem. Why should the caring professions be looked down upon or have less social status than other professions? But also maybe this division between engineering and the caring professions is a bit artificial. Like maybe what we think is a natural fact that there's the sciences and there's the caring professions is maybe those divisions will look different in 20 years, let alone in 100. So we should be careful to what conclusions we reach. But on the other hand, I'm not at all allergic to the data describing what is happening now. Right. So if you want to get more women into the sciences, that goal may be politically suspect from the start. That may not be a good way to measure the emancipation of women.
Here's the thing about this. All right.
Okay.
The data you describe, the data itself doesn't really have anything to do with evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology is just the way that data is interpreted, right? So
right.
the thing that distinguishes evolutionary psychologists from other psychologists and from other people that research this kind of stuff is that they appeal to evolutionary forces to build explanatory models and theory, right? So this is what I was talking to Charles Roseman about. And, you can make a good, and Roseman he's an evolutionary biologist, right? He's so he's expert at that. And he can make, I'm sure, a good scientific argument against that kind of evolutionary interpretation of the data, right?
Mm-hmm.
Almost certainly can be done. Or at least, I'm not an expert in biological evolution, but I'll make the assumption that somebody who is can make a good, legitimate scientific criticism of the evolutionary part of evolutionary psychology, right? That still doesn't change the fact that we find this, data that says, hey, guess what? There might be some difference in career appeal between males and females that has nothing to do with society, right? Maybe there is some biological difference, right? Do you have to explain it with evolution for it to piss people off? Or, no, it's just the fact, it's just what it is.
What other biological explanation would there be?
Well, okay, so here another point. All right. There are, I don't know, you would think that it would come from evolution, right? That makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe it does. I don't know, but I'm just saying that's one theory, one way to explain it. Well, obviously it comes from evolution. What I think the evolutionary psychology part is, I think people would talk about, that somebody would, in order for it to be evolutionary psychology, someone would have to produce a theory that pointed to some particular evolutionary process that led to it, right? Now, maybe they can do that, right? Now, they have to provide it as a testable theory, right? Maybe they can do that. Maybe they can't. I'll let people like Charles Roseman evaluate it. But whether they provide that evolutionary, whether someone finds a compelling evolutionary explanation or not, the difference is still there. It came from something, so it's real. It's not, you can't simply dismiss it as the outcome of a patriarchal society, or rather, you can't simply dismiss it as the outcome of an oppressive society, right? So it interferes with a particular kind of, it's an example of political theory not making room for understanding of the individual. Maybe there are biological differences between males and females, and maybe they do influence the affinity somebody has for a career, for the kinds of things they like, the intellectual pursuits they enjoy. Maybe there is a sex-based difference, right? There could be. And if there is, then you're going to see, in a free society, you're going to see females tend to do one thing, males are going to tend to do the other. Whether you give that, whether you tie that to some evolutionary mechanism, it's hardly the point. So, this is another thing. This is another reason why, I think evolutionary psychology is an easy punching bag, because it's easy to say, oh, it's just a bunch of just so stories, and okay, well, first, if the evolutionary psychologist has stated their idea, their theory in a testable way, then it's not a just so story. It's a testable theory. If the theory gets, if people test it and turns out it doesn't really support that data, then, they got to change it, right? Or reject it or whatever. But you could give a just so story, and it's easy to do that. And people like Jordan Peterson are famous for doing it, right? His example of, giving of the saying we found out that there's serotonin in lobsters, and lobsters have this, and it varies with this lobster social hierarchy. Therefore, capitalist hierarchies in human society are natural, right? Well, that's a just so story, right? It's I say, okay, it could be.
And a lot of problems with what Jordan Peterson says happens on both sides. Like, first of all, to what extent is hierarchy, which he's trying to argue for, a really at the center or a defining characteristic of capitalism? I'm not so sure that it is,
Well,
right? We have a higher. Do we always have to have a hierarchy in order to produce capital? I don't think we do. So there's that problem. And then the other problem is the science. But let me ask you this. I want to ask you something that gets to the heart of one of the difficulties I have with evolutionary psychology, and I've never quite been able to express it before. And I want your answer to this, and I'd be glad to be convinced and like be told, have my misunderstanding or fears assuaged. Because I see psychology itself as being produced socially as a field, out of modernity and the emphasis on the individual, right? You didn't need to worry about individual human psychology or the inner world of people when they didn't have any way to participate in society beyond whatever station they were born into. So you didn't worry about their psychic structure. So because I see psychology as basically bourgeois, when we look to evolutionary psychology, I worry that we're taking this psychological character of humanity back in time to like caveman days, and I just wonder to whether or not if just evolution itself might be more worthwhile, because at that stage, a certain stage in human development, or what would become human development, we're talking about animals with instincts and no social life as we understand it, because that includes minds and individuals as we understand it, or if not our own individual minds and the mind of God or some divine, some sort of cultural animal. But so it might be pre-culture, or maybe we should talk about evolutionary sociology instead, because we want to find out.
There is a field.
Yeah, right. So we want to find out what evolutionary forces had an impact on the success rate of social groups and social formations, and what kinds of, we could say, the reason these religions have lasted is because of evolution, and these forms of government are more resilient because of evolution. And then I wonder about how we would go about that. It seems very difficult to figure out, well beyond my pay grade. But what do you think about this problem of that psychology itself presupposes a kind of person that, from my point of view, it's really relatively new to the scene?
Okay.
No,
okay. Yes and no. All right.
Okay.
Yes, in that the psychology. First, remember that psychology isn't really one thing, right? So when you refer to the field of psychology, there isn't really one whole field. So in other words, you can talk about like clinical and the helping professions of applied mental health type psychology, right? That's one thing. And then there's, sort of laboratory scientific psychology, which is another. And within that, there are different branches. And then there are other applied areas, right? Psychology of organizations and corporation, things like that, right? I've done some work in that myself. And so you got to be specific. But to your point, I know exactly the area of psychology you're talking about, and your criticism is on target. I mean, when you think about the sort of, a lot of applied areas of psychology, right? It absolutely is. It does conceptualize or have this idea of a bourgeois subject and those sorts. I mean, that's accurate, right? And it did develop historically within recent capitalist society, right? Absolutely. And those forces drove it and make it what it is, right? Absolutely, 100%. And this is where this conversation starts to interface with Ashley Frawley's books, like Semiotics of Happiness, right? In Semiotics of Happiness, she goes through and she does a really good job of talking about and demonstrating how these social forces, right, these current capitalist forces, produce a kind of knowledge area in these helping sciences, psi disciplines, that produce a knowledge area in these psi disciplines that support the bureaucratic or capitalist structure, right? And that happened. That's historically how it developed. Absolutely, 100%. And I honestly can't imagine any psychologist that works in that area disagreeing with that. Society has produced, a market evolved for a kind of transactional process, consumer transactional kind of a process where you identify a problem, you go to the market for a solution, you pay for it, and you get it, right? That's so, a particular way of looking at the individual had to be developed to meet that market demand, and it did.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you can look at accurately, and I think few people would disagree. You can look at you can look at clinical psychology, the applied practice of clinical psychology, counseling psychology, and other related mental health kinds of fields. You can look at them that way, and it's not inaccurate. But that's not the same thing as, that's one area. When you look at the science of psychology, it comes out of that. That's not, like all sciences, it's certainly, it always has, what would you say, capitalist drivers that tend to shape it in certain ways. There's, no doubt. I would say though, having seen a good bit of the way grants are written at universities for psychological research and things like that, I don't think capitalism itself is necessarily the driving factor, like a lot of leftist people on the left would say it is. I think it's a driving factor, but I swear to God, when you get into these big corporate structures, big bureaucratic structures like government, big universities, big corporations and stuff like that, there's this kind of bureaucratic mentality and quest for power that transcends capitalist analysis. and it comes into play here. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but it comes into play here, and it starts to drive the way people start to conceive of things and whatnot.
Well, so, I'm not saying that what's motivating the research is
there's an element. There is an element
to accumulate capital. What I'm saying is we all have these sort of starting assumptions that we aren't always aware of, and which aren't always even bad. Like, I think starting from the idea that individual subjectivity and power is important is a good thing. But politically and
you can't start with that.
Yeah, you can't say, okay, let's already assume basically that human beings have been free for all of human history, and have had this concept of freedom and this and a social life that supports their freedom from the very dawn of humanity. Okay, from the very beginning. No, I don't know if that's true. I wouldn't say that other animals are free in quite the same way that I think humanity could be. Right. I'm not saying they couldn't become free, but it might take more than it would take more than politics to get them there. For, raccoons and things like that. So what I'm saying is, like, when we think about evolution, if we presuppose that the way human beings evolved was through the private decision making of free individuals, and then we say, what biological factors were there shaping those free, independent decisions? We're presupposing something that we should not presuppose. That's what I'm starting
That's
with.
not what, here's the way, I'll tell you the way a research psychologist is going to look at this. This is the way I was taught to do it.
Okay, yeah, tell me.
This is the way I was taught to do it by some, relatively well-known cognitive psychologists who were part of cognitive revolution. And anyway, first, this is post-positivist, right? Way of epistemologically. So you start with the assumption that you just don't know, right? And you attempt to make as few assumptions as possible about anything. So when you're studying, cognition, the way people think, emotional processing, you are not presupposing a particular subject, at least not in the way you are when you're talking about someone that comes into your office for counseling, right?
Mhm.
You're looking at it. Suppose suppose you encountered a computer for the first time. You didn't know what it was, right?
Mhm.
And you're trying to figure out how it worked. All right. You can't suppose it's anything, right? You don't know what it is, right? Until you start to poke around in it, until you start to try things, do this to it and see what it does, do that to it and see what it does, try to create something like it and see if it acts the same way, right? You don't know what it is. You can't make assumptions about what it is or how it works. So that's the approach you take, right? When you start, and then your goal is to build a theory to explain something, right? And you're not, and this is another issue. There, in scientific psychology, right? This sort of area, and this spans a lot of areas. You aren't making a holistic theory about all of the mind. I mean, there are people who do that, right? But if you work on more of an experimental level, you're trying to explain very specific phenomena, and you're trying to build models of relatively specific phenomena. So it's not as if you're starting with this broad model of the person in society, and then you're saying, oh, well, here's how, here's why, when you give them this list of words and this other list of words, they respond in XYZ time here. And so, it's you're starting from zero, right? And you're trying to say, okay, what can this thing be? And you're trying to, build a testable theory and go from there. And that approach has told us a lot, but it hasn't told us much, but in the broad scope of thing hasn't told us much. It hasn't given us a model of the whole person. Just doesn't exist, right? There is no scientific model of the mind, right? There are scientific approaches to studying the mind, but any scientific models of the mind that we have at present are anemic, right? They just, we've got general ideas for the way it probably works, but, I mean, you compare scientific psychology to something like Lacan, for example, right? And this is why I like Lacan. I mean, I'm not a Lacanian. I look at Lacan purely metaphorically, but I think it's a marvelous model because it is a model of psychology, and it explains anything, right? That's a model of a whole person, right? That's what a model of a whole person looks like. That's a whole person and a whole person in society. So, Lacan, that model can explain anything, right? You want to understand why a character in a novel, behave the way they did. You can come up with a Lacanian explanation, right? You can't do that with science. We just don't have models like that, right? There are no scientific models that provide these big, these broad cause and effect relationships and allow you to, across contexts and domains and all this, tie everything together. It just doesn't. Could
you conceivably come up with a scientific approach that could do that? That could explain everything
eventually. Theoretically, sure, but we're just nowhere near it. And here's the other thing about that. By the time we figure it out, it could be we no longer care. By the time we figure it out, it might be that that's just not a concern to us anymore. The stuff that we studied, stuff that people worried about 10,000 years ago, it's not the stuff we worry about now. So I'd imagine eventually.
Listen, we've done about 42 minutes. I want to do another session for the patrons, but before we end this first half, I just want to ask you, do you think I frequently, when I'm talking to you, will lead us to this question of, like, I think it's called the demarcation problem, right? And you just, to me, brought it up again. Like you said, I don't think Lacan is a science. And I just want to know, like, how do you distinguish between, like, Freudian psychology and scientific approaches?
Whether it's testable, whether it makes testable predictions, whether it builds theory that makes testable predictions. That's all. Lacan doesn't do that. It doesn't intend to.
I mean, didn't Freud think that he was basing it on a biological and testable scientific?
Well, I mean, yes, but he also would have said that he also would have said we have no way of testing the things I'm saying, right? So in other words, I mean, Freud gave us a way of conceiving of the mind, right? That was useful, across a lot of areas. It wasn't, I mean, like Lacan. I mean, I think Freud and Lacan were, here's what way I think of both of them, is they were both practicing therapists, right? So they both, I mean, what they did is people came in, talked about their problems, and, Lacan, Freud tried to help them, right? Try to figure out. So after seeing lots of patients, hearing lots of problems, hearing lots of life stories, right? They came up with a model that explains what they saw, right? Explained what they saw. Not just their own patients, but they read other stuff. Well, you know what I mean? They put it within the context of society and so on. So they built models, right? That explain these things, give you a way of thinking about these things, that you need. I mean, whenever we talk about politics or any social phenomenon, we again have to have some idea of, well, how do people fit in? How does the individual fit in this, right? How do people interact here? So, Freud and especially Lacan will potentially, well, not especially, but they can help with that, right? And give you clues about that. Now, they're not science because they don't produce testable theory. I mean, to the extent that they do, it fails, right? I mean, I've brought up with people before, like Lacan's mirror phase. He talks about how the importance of an infant seeing its reflection and creating a sense of self-identity, whatever the case it is, or not an infant, but small child. You know what I'm talking about. So, well, there's empirical evidence that just says there's no such thing as that, right? But does that mean it's not a useful concept? Well, no, because it fits in with a bunch of other stuff Lacan says, which provides this, again, a way for us to talk about stuff, right? So Lacan and Freud provide us a language for talking about human behavior and mental phenomena, right?
Well, so, I mean, but the problem with the mirror stage, I was going to say something about that, was the problem with the mirror stage is if Lacan is trying to create a trans-historical theory of the human mind after, let's say, the frontal lobe was evolved or whatever, to talk about the mirror stage is clearly a mistake because there weren't always mirrors, right? So how could there be a need for a mirror stage?
Right. I mean, metaphorically, you could say that there was some kind of event where the child recognized itself as distinct and so on. But there just isn't any evidence for that, right? I mean, there's been a lot of research on child development and so on over the years, decades, and there just clearly it's not a real thing that happens, but it might be a real metaphorical thing. I mean, a child does have to have a way of distinguishing itself from everything else and other people, and children do have to have a way of identifying who the dad is and the meaning of the dad and the mom. And those are things that have to happen. Right. And we need a way to talk about it. So,
yeah,
science just doesn't give it to us. So anyway,
yeah, let's leave it right there. And we'll talk about just what science is.
We're talking about what science is. Yes. So I'm prefacing. So I went through all that just to say, I'm not trying to say that it has to be science only. I'm trying to say I'm fully aware it can't be science only, but I do want people to have a real understanding of what science is, and that it's not witchcraft and it's not trying to prove capitalism is natural. So.
Well, right. I totally understand that. All right. So I'm going to stop the stream here. I'm going to send you another link in just a minute here.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.